In a bowl of mountains where the road curls like a tired snake and fog sits low as guilt, there's a hollow the map won't name. Folks point with their chins because fingers are for things you're sure about. In that hollow, the creek talks in riddles, the ridgeline keeps it hat on, and the wind has a way of moving the same story from porch to porch until it forgets how to end. What I'm about to tell you isn't legend. It's inventory. Names taken down in pencil that smudged, parcels unclaimed at the depot, a church ledger with pages torn, a flower tin with a list written small enough to shame a conscience. It's a string of women who went walking in daylight and never arrived at where the path promised. It's a pair of sisters who learned the price of mercy, and then opened a store that sold something else. Before we step off the road and onto the moss, tell me where you're watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe. We dig up the histories that won't sit still, the ones official books leave out because the mirrors they hold up are too honest. I'll warn you now, this story doesn't rely on curses. It relies on patience. They called them Eliza and Pearl because the preacher had a soft spot for Bible names and jewelry. 18 on the same day, born so close that the midwife swore the first dragged the second into the world by the wrist. Not twins in the way of looking, Eliza plain as a fence post with eyes that counted, Pearl with a smile that could undress a secret, but twinned in the ways that matter. When Eliza hummed, Pearl knew the tune. When Pearl lied, Eliza wrote the truth down somewhere only she could find. Mama June left before the mountain thawed the year the timber company came. Some say she died, some say she walked. Both answers suit a place where leaving and dying share a door. No father stepped forward. The sisters learned their letters from a traveling Bible seller who traded red-bound testaments for eggs and gossip. After he left, they practiced in ash on the hearthstone until words sat still. By 16, Eliza could read a deed and Pearl could read a room. By 18, each could read the other without moving their mouths. They lived in a linter of a house hiked halfway up the slope, the kind of place that doesn't notice when it loses a board because it never counted boards to begin with. A stovepipe went out the roof like a finger raised for silence. Around back, a root cellar squared itself against hunger. People said the sisters could call crows. What they could do was listen. When the wind carried voices from the road, Pearl knew which steps belonged to worry and which to want. When men laughed too loud, Eliza counted the beats between their words and wrote a number beside each name in the margin of a feed bill. The county itself was a congregation of needs. A sawmill at the bend. A general store with nails and barrels and scrip in a drawer that didn't balance. A white church with a bell that cracked on a Sunday and was never fixed because the sound it made carried a warning people had learned to ignore. Sheriff Abner Holt kept order the way a man keeps bees. A little smoke, a little bluff, a little belief that stings belong to other days. The timber agent, Mr. Baines, wore a hat like a verdict and spoke as if the mountain owed him interest. The first name I'll set on the table is Martha Ellen Hatch. Seamstress. Widow. Hands so good that a hem stitched by Martha walks straighter. She left the church social with a bag of potato rolls and a scrap of blue calico and was meant to stop at the depot to measure a baby's christening gown. Pearl walked her as far as the split in the trail. Folks saw that much. Pearl pointed to the short way by the creek because the bridge is slick but faster, and you've got pies to bake. Martha smiled, thanked her, and stepped into the shade. She never arrived at the depot. The bag was found downstream, bread soaked and blue calico wound so tight around a branch it left dye on the bark like a bruise. 2 weeks later, a parcel showed up addressed to nobody anyone knew. Brown paper, string tight as a prayer. Inside, a thimble, a lock of hair tied with thread, and a note cut from a newspaper, letters patched to make a sentence that didn't fit any sermon. "Better clay," it said, and that was all. Sheriff Holt folded the paper with his neat hands and told the deacon to hush it for the sake of the children. The deacon nodded, then told his wife, who told the woman who kept hens on the hillside, who told Pearl when she came to trade for eggs. Pearl listened like a girl grateful for news. Eliza looked at the note once and didn't look again. By the time the leaves went the color of old pennies, 2 more names had turned to questions. Nancy Pike, the Sawyer sister, never returned from picking bloodroot. Ruthie Gray, 17, left a pail at the spring and never came home for the supper she'd asked her mother to save. The sheriff made posters that the rain learned to read. The timber agent suggested wolves. The preacher said the devil walked to and fro and his shoes didn't need mending. On the last Sunday of October, Pearl sang louder than her throat looked able, and Eliza signed the hymn number on the chalkboard without turning toward the pews. You'll want to know why the sisters drew so much talk without drawing a single charge. Here's what the mountain told me: they owed no one. They owned nothing anyone could prove worth stealing. They gave away broth when fevers took, and they pruned the churchyard roses when nobody asked. They stood at the back of photographs so their faces cut off at the chin. They were everywhere in a way that leaves no fingerprints. Still, there were inventories. At the general store, Mr. Murdoch kept a ledger in which he tallied money owed, sacks of flour carried out, bolts of cloth unrolled. On the corner of one page, E&P. settled in full. No one remembered the sisters paying with cash. Eliza had a way of offering numbers until the other person agreed they made sense. Pearl had a way of using words that pressed until men felt tall for stepping aside. A traveling peddler, name of a horror or not, that's what he gave, claimed he'd met the sisters at dusk on the ridge and they'd asked after his mother by name. He was drunk when he told it, and sober when he'd swear he never did. A midwife from over the next mountain said she'd seen Pearl carrying a little book bound in oilcloth, the sort of thing a man would call a ledger and a woman a list. She said Pearl's thumb never left the edge. She said Eliza watched the horizon as if time were coming like weather. That winter came early and hard. The creek learned to hold its breath. Doors swelled and refused visitors. Folks took to counting what they loved at night before the lamp ran dry. At a meeting in the church, Sheriff Holt folded his hat in his hands and said he deputized 2 men to walk the ridge in pairs and to knock on doors polite as they could. The timber agent sat in the front pew and did not take off his hat. Pearl sat in the last pew and did not sing. Eliza stood outside by the bell rope with a palm on the frayed twist and counted. When the door-to-doors got to the sisters' place, no one was home. A pot on the stove had a skin on top. The way soup gets when someone intends to return. 2 cups on the table, both clean but still wet. A flour tin on the shelf with a lid that lifted easy and then stuck, like something underneath didn't want air. Sheriff Holt, careful, decent in the ways that count, did not pry. He closed the stove door and said, "We'll come back by daylight." The men left. The creek rearranged its ice. Before the thaw, another parcel came, addressed to the sheriff himself. This one held a church ribbon and a scrap of burlap that smelled of lye. No note, no ransom, no accusation that would give a man something to fight. Sheriff Holt sat with the parcel until the lamp gave up. Then he put the ribbon in his pocket and the burlap in the stove. He did not tell the deacon. Mr. Baines already knew. Men like that assume news belongs to them. And here the story tips. Because on a day when the sun found the road and made mud of it, Pearl appeared at the general store with a basket of biscuits and a request for nails. "Small ones," she said, "the kind that hold without showing." Eliza waited by the door, chin tucked, eyes counting. Mr. Murdoch weighed the nails like the scale could confess something. The sisters thanked him in the way where gratitude looks like permission to leave. By spring, the mountain would give up what the sisters had buried and keep what they hadn't. By summer, the creek would cough up a box that had no business floating. By harvest, the last page of the oilcloth book would be full, and the bell that cracked would ring true once, just once. When somebody pulled the rope at midnight and nobody owned that courage. But that's for later. For now, mark down these facts on your own scrap of paper. A seamstress who didn't arrive, parcels sent without words, sisters who owed nobody and remembered everything, a county that decided quiet was better than answers. We're at the step where you either turn back or go forward knowing your shoes will never feel clean again. Thor came early and mean, peeling the road up like old tape and letting the creek speak with a mouthful of pins. Folks said the mountain smells different the week the frost lets go. wet iron, sour leaf, secrets finally ready to rot where they lay. Sheriff Holt took that week to walk the ridge with his hat in his hand and his questions folded to the size of a matchbook. He asked for nothing more than directions and names. He left with the kind of silence that knows it's been paid for. Eliza and Pearl were seen everywhere and nowhere. Pearl with a basket on her arm ferrying biscuits and gossip. Eliza behind her like a shadow taking notes only she could see. They mended the parson's shingles without asking and set a pie on the depot bench for the telegrapher who hadn't had a visitor since Christmas. When the thaw pushed the creek out of its bed, the sisters stood on the bank and watched it carry off a fence post, a child's shoe, a story that had run out of places to hide. Mr. Baines, hat like a verdict, called a meeting in the schoolhouse. He leaned on the teacher's desk and said words like wolves, imports, and itinerant vagrants with the confidence of a man who had never misplaced a daughter. Sheriff Holt said little. The deacon prayed long. Pearl dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief that looked like a piece of weather. Eliza studied the knots in the floor. That night, a lantern burned in the sisters' kitchen past decent hours. 2 cups steamed, one with tea sweet enough to bless a wound, one dark as creek water under brush. Eliza unrolled a length of oilcloth and smoothed a small book flat. Names. Dates. A symbol like a crooked ladder beside some, like a kill beside others, like a bell rope beside one. Pearl said, "We are almost done." Eliza said, "We don't stop because done is a word for people who don't count." Down valley, a dog howled the way dogs do when the old rules are being rewritten. Up valley, the church bell's cracked throat practiced one clear note, then remembered itself and went quiet. Somewhere between those two sounds, something changed its mind about staying buried. The creek coughed up a box the size of regret. Pine, tarred at the seams, bound in string that had learned not to break. Boys poking for fish pulled it ashore and shouted for the sheriff because shouting for your mother would have admitted you knew what was inside. Sheriff Holt set his knife under the string and lifted. Inside, a spool of blue thread, a row of bone buttons, a thimble dented at the rim, a scrap of newsprint with letters cut and rearranged until they made the words "Better Clay." He stood very still. Bone buttons can belong to anyone until they don't. The blue was the blue Martha Ellen Hatch had favored for christening gowns, the kind that made babies look like a promise. He closed the box, bound it again, and walked it to the church because no man in that county owned a drawer that could hold it steady. The deacon paled and looked at the windows like they might have something to add. Pearl stood in the back pew, head bowed, fingers moving as if counting stitches. Eliza waited outside by the rope, eyes on the knoll where the grave grass always greened first. "Better clay," Mr. Baines scoffed when he heard, like a man insulted by poetry. "Clay's clay. What you want is lime." He said lime as if it were mercy. A few men nodded because nodding is cheaper than thinking. Sheriff Holt didn't argue. He was learning that every word the sisters used had 2 meanings, the one a man could hold and the one that did the holding. At the general store, Mr. Murdoch wrapped sugar in brown paper and told Pearl he had her small nails on order. "Hold without showing," he said, like he'd remembered the phrase because she had put it there for him. Pearl smiled the way you do when doors open without your hand on them. Eliza counted change aloud, not because Mr. Murdoch needed help, but because numbers spoken out loud are witnesses. The peddler O'Hara came through again, sober this time, hat in hand. He swore he'd seen a woman on the ridge wearing blue. No coat, no shoes, skin the color of creek clay after rain. He said she moved like she was being followed by something that wanted to be forgiven. He said he called out and she turned without eyes. He said a lot of things that made the store go quiet and Mr. Murdoch busy himself with the barrel of nails. Pearl thanked him softly and gave him a biscuit. Eliza asked what date that had been and wrote it in a margin. That night, when the moon sat fat on the ridge like a neighbor, the sisters carried a crate to the creek and listened. The mountain breathed in. The crate went under clean. Pearl wiped her hands on her apron and whispered, "Better clay." Eliza answered, "Better memory," and neither looked back to see what floated. People who knew Mama June only by the songs she left behind liked to say she smiled at babies and went to her Bible when men raised their voices. The midwife, who had seen her work with harder tools, told a different story the afternoon she sat on Eliza's stoop and asked for water. She was a woman who kept everything that mattered in jars, the midwife said, and she wrote the names of the months on paper when the year insisted it was all the same. From Mama June, the sisters learned the clean economies. How to scald a jar so it would hold silence, how to not twine once so it would never undo, how to choose ground that keeps what you ask it to. Clay that crumbles is for children, she had said, pressing a palm of red earth into Pearl's hand. Clay that holds is for secrets. The midwife tapped her knee. You girls remember. They did. There was another lesson, unpretty and exactly useful. Patience that looks like kindness. Mama June sold turnip greens to men who laughed and counted their coins twice. She gave broth to women who cried without making a sound. She listened hard enough to learn when a man's voice meant danger and when it only meant a bad Sunday. Eliza collected the first kind of listening, Pearl the second. In the schoolhouse, Miss Fairweather taught sums by drawing pies and chalking slices. Eliza watched the chalk dust fall and understood division as something that left nobody whole. Pearl watched Miss Fairweather's hands and understood that rings can be removed when you need to pass for someone who isn't watched. They grew up into the kind of women who mark doors as they pass with eyes no one notices moving. The timber agent came up their path with 2 men in tow and a smile that showed all his teeth. Ladies, Mr. Baines said, we are deputizing help. Any strong backs around here? Eliza wiped her hands on a rag that hadn't minded getting dirty. Just ours, she said. Pearl stepped forward before his gaze could settle. We can feed the searchers, she offered, and the way she said feed turned every hungry man in earshot into a volunteer. That night the yard was full of boots and talk. Pearl ladled stew into bowls until the stew pot told a different story than hunger. Eliza collected spoons in a tin and counted them twice. The men told each other where to look for wolves and where to look for devils. They did not ask how a table set for 12 had been ready in 4 minutes, or why the nails on the back door gleamed like decisions. Mr. Baines licked his thumb and killed the lamp without asking. The dark put its hat on and came inside. A root cellar is a kind of church if you build it right. Brick courses steady, dirt tamped to the stubbornness of a vow, shelves at the right width for jars that keep more than carrots. Eliza had taken those small nails and set them like punctuation, commas where you rest, periods where you stop, a question mark where you'd better answer fast. The door hung honest. The latch slid true. The floor looked like floor even where floor was trap. Pearl did the above-ground work, a smile for the man with a leash on his voice, a cup of sweet for the woman who thought she could outrun what her mother heard, a word at the depot about how the short path along the creek would save steps if your feet were already arguing. People thanked her for saving them time. Pearl never said time is what kills you if you don't own it. Women went missing most in daylight because daylight has the nerve to look safe. Nancy Pike's basket of bloodroot came back to her mother's door at supper, full of roots as requested, handle clean. Ruthie Gray's pail sat at the spring, water level trembling like a throat about to lie. The church ladies braided the ribbons tighter on their hats. Men sharpened reasons. Sheriff Holt burned his coffee and didn't notice. At the store, Mr. Murdoch read over last year's ledger and found a habit he hadn't clocked. The sisters paid in exact change for flour and lamp oil, and sometimes the total had a strange penny in it, like a tax nobody else was charged. When he closed up, he ran a thumb over the penciled words E and P. Settled in full, and thought about who gets to write settled and why. That evening, Sheriff Holt came to the sisters' door alone. He took off his hat before he knocked because that's what you do when you walk into a room where women have already decided what you'll be allowed to see. Eliza let him in. Pearl poured him tea. He looked at their table. 2 cups. A third set aside upside down like a promise. He asked if they'd seen Martha Ellen Hatch. Pearl asked if he'd fixed the bell. He said no. She said, "Then you're missing more than women." He took his tea, drank once, and set it down in a ring that would never fade. "Someone is sending me boxes," he said. "What would you have me do?" Eliza wiped the table with a square of burlap that smelled faintly of lye. "Boxes go where we send them or they float," she said. "You should learn which is which." Pearl slid the cup closer to his hand like an invitation to choose. When he left, the sister stood in the doorway and watched him walk the curve of the path. "He has the bell rope in his pocket," Pearl said. "He does," Eliza agreed, "but not the nerve to pull." Ahara, maybe Ahara, made the mistake of bringing company up county. Two men, hard-jawed, with the sort of eyes that promise to cash in favors you don't remember giving. They called themselves investigators, said they'd find the girls for the price of being told they had. They asked bad questions with the hungry patience of debt. At the store they bought rope and pork and matches. At the church they sat in the back pew and measured the room. At the creek they smoked and watched the water pick its teeth. Pearl got their names like a magician gets a coin, with a patter that makes men show you what they think is theirs. Eliza wrote down those names and drew beside each the crooked ladder mark. Climb up, decide if the rungs hold. The men liked Pearl enough to ask for directions and Eliza enough to accept them. At the fork in the trail, Pearl pointed the way that would make the creek sound like it was behind you even when it wasn't. The men went laughing. The mountain listened to their laughter until it wasn't laughter anymore. A day later, one came back missing, exactly, his hat. He told a story about a cave that breathed and a lantern that refused to stay lit and a woman singing in a voice too young for the words. Sheriff Holt folded his arms and let the man wear his own fear until it fitted. "Where's your friend?" he asked. The man said a word that rhymed with drowned without committing. Pearl put a hand to her mouth like she'd seen a sparrow hit a window. Eliza counted the man's blinks. Even numbers lie. That night, the bell rope moved without a hand on it. Nobody saw, but everybody felt the air pulling in. The cracked bell gave one note as clean as a promise, then went back to being its old self. Dogs barked in their sleep. Babies woke to the taste of sugar on their tongues. The creek agreed to keep most of what it had been given, but returned a scrap of burlap rubbed thin by worry. The next parcel was not a box. It was a jar, lidded tight, sealed with wax that smelled of apple cores and discipline. Inside, a hunk of clay with finger marks pressed in like tally. Sheriff Holt held it to the light. The clay was from the far bank, red as a scald. The finger marks were small. He thought of Ruthie Gray and the way she'd kept her pencil sharp enough to draw blood from paper. He set the jar down and decided to stop asking the mountain questions it wasn't trying to answer. The oilcloth book showed itself once, to the only man it could hurt and help at the same time. Sheriff Holt came by the sister's place at dusk claiming borrowed salt. Eliza set the jar on the table, Pearl put a cup by his hand, and the book, like a tame thing too long penned, slid out from under a cloth and sat between them without being introduced. It looked like a recipe book because men are trained to relax when pages promise food. It read like a court record if you took the time. Names, right justified like guilty verdicts. Dates in margins. Abbreviations that could be sugar or shame. Rise, proof, kill, keep. Beside Martha Ellen Hatch, kill, better clay. Beside Nancy Pike, proof, bell. Beside Ruthie Gray, keep, blue. There were men's names too, Mr. Baines with an inventory of receipts like bones stacked in a woodhouse, Ahara with a dashed line where a heart should be. What is this? Holt asked, voice small for a man who wore the county on his badge. Eliza didn't answer. Pearl tapped the line that read bell with a fingernail that sounded like counting. Your job, she said. He turned the page. The crooked ladder appeared beside some entries, the kill beside others, the bell rope beside the saddest. He saw his own name in a corner with a line through it. Why am I crossed out? He whispered, not sure if he wanted the truth. You were going to leave, Pearl said, matter of fact, and then you decided to stay. We had to mark the difference. Eliza took the book back the way a woman takes a baby from someone who looks like dropping it. He went home, lay on his bed without taking off his boots, and stared at the ceiling while moths made geometry around the lamp. At dawn, he wrapped the bell rope around his hand and pulled. The cracked bell found its clear note again and held it long enough for the dogs to stop pretending they didn't understand. Mr. Baines arrived with men and a warrant that smelled of printer's ink and impatience. "We are done with riddles," he said, and his mouth made the shape of a man about to add ladies in a way that would require spitting afterward. Sheriff Holt stepped between the men and the sisters' door. "Not today," he told the paper and the men holding it. Mr. Baines smiled thin. "You can't keep a river from its business." Holt touched the bell rope as if it were a gun. "Fairs are for forgetting and for noticing." The county spring fair pitched itself on the flat by the depot and dared the mountain to disapprove. Pig judging at noon. Quilts like weather maps. Lemonade sour enough to make grown men lick their teeth. The sisters set up a table of pies with a sign that said only, "Pay what's owed." Folks laughed and paid double, because guilt buys more than hunger. Pearl worked the aisle the way where the work's a wheat field. Laughter here, a hand there, a look that made men remember a promise to their wives they had not kept. Eliza sat on a crate with a pencil tucked behind her ear and made small notes no one could read at a distance. She watched girls' feet, the scuff of hesitation, the quick step of flight, the drag of being pulled by the elbow of duty. She drew a bell beside one girl's name and underlined it twice. By afternoon, someone had tied blue ribbon around the cracked church bell as a joke. By evening, the ribbon had changed from blue to something the eye couldn't pin, like creek water taking light and giving it back meaner. Mr. Baines won the hog weight guessing and crowed like a rooster. Sheriff Holt stood by the lemonade and counted strangers. The peddler ate an apple down to the seeds and then counted those. A girl nobody knew won the pie-eating contest and cried afterward in the shadow of the cotton candy machine. Pearl handed her a napkin and asked if she'd like to see the view from the ridge. Eliza, from the crate, said, "It's a fine day for it." The girl nodded and followed without looking back to see if anyone noticed her absence. Someone always notices. Not the right someone. Not in time. When the fair packed up, a crate remained behind with a label that had been smudged to story, "To be held." Mr. Murdoch dragged it into the store and set it in the back room where jars grow their own dust. He didn't open it. He slept with his ledger under his pillow and dreamed of nails that slipped out of wood and walked away. Stings take patience, and patience was the only thing Holt had in surplus. He asked Miss Fairweather to help, because a schoolteacher knows how to stand still when men lie. She agreed with the kind of nod women use when agreeing not to be surprised later. They rehearsed being lost, being grateful, being new. They chose a dress that said, "I belong to nobody yet," and shoes that trusted the road. They practiced the sentence, "Would you show me the short way?" The sisters saw through it the way you see through glass. Pearl met the teacher at the spring, smiled, and complimented the dress without exactly liking it. Eliza appeared a moment later at the bend where the creek sounds far, hair pinned like a warning. "Not today," she told the air. Miss Fairweather dipped her head. "Another day, then." The trap didn't spring, but it moved. Holt had men posted under brush with orders to listen and remember. They heard Pearl's laugh turn itself down like a lamp. They heard Eliza's voice count to 5 and then stop. They heard a crow say a word crows shouldn't learn. They did not hear a struggle, because the sisters didn't bother with clatter. The cabin took fire that night, not the sisters' place, but the old turpentine shed on the far bank where boys had learned to spit and men to swear. Flames skated the roof and asked the sky for partnership. Holt and 3 men formed a line with the creek in their hats and made a ceremony of pretending to win. When the roof gave, a shower of nail heads rang like a choir. In the ash next morning he found a hinge that didn't belong to that door and a key that didn't belong to any lock the county owned. He palmed both and said nothing. The crate in Mr. Murdoch's back room began to stink of something the human tongue refuses to name. He pried it open and found, wrapped in lye-soaked burlap, A ledger. Not his. Not anyone's who kept track with ink. Oilcloth binding. Pages lined by hand. The crooked ladder in the corner. The kill. The bell. Names. Owed. Paid. Kept. A last page with one line and no mark. Eliza and Pearl? By some of the missing went from women to daughters to girls to stories. Families ate with windows open in case a voice remembered its way home. Men who had sworn there were wolves stopped saying the word out loud because the mountain had not left prints that matched it. The preacher trimmed his sermons down to nouns and begged God with a voice that had lost its adjectives. Mr. Baines took a leave. Business, he said, and his hat agreed. Holt followed the key. He took it to every lock that tolerated inquiry. It matched nothing until it matched something that wasn't a door. A box sunk into the floor under the sisters' table that no one had thought to pry because prying required the kind of rudeness the county still believed itself too good for. He waited for dusk because dusk forgives trespass, then went with a lantern and a prayer he didn't admit to owning. The box held keepsakes that weren't his to touch and evidence no jury would be brave enough to see. Ribbons, mostly, blue that had gone the color of regret, red that refused to fade, white that looked like a lie. A thimble dented at the rim. A scrap of the church bell rope, cut clean. And under those, letters. Not ransom. Not confession. One line over and over in different hands. I said yes. Holt read until his throat went sour. Saying yes and being allowed to change your mind are not the same arrangements. He put the letters back the way a man washes the dead, without expecting thanks and with a plan for forgetting the details. When he stood to leave, Pearl was at the door with her palm on the lintel. Eliza stood behind her in the shadow, eyes turned toward the mountain because it was polite to give a man a chance to explain himself. "You came in the decent way," Pearl said. He nodded. Eliza asked, "Do you intend to pull the bell?" He touched the rope in his pocket without meaning to. "I intend to listen," he said. "That would be new," Pearl answered, and stepped aside so he could go out without turning his back. Years rarely solve anything. They just file the edges off. Children who'd learned to go to sleep without the sound of certain voices grew up into people who locked doors in daylight and tied sashes the opposite way from their mothers. The sawmill changed hands twice. The church replaced the cracked bell and told itself nothing was being admitted. Mr. Murdoch died with his ledger under his pillow and the page marked Eliza and Pearl folded up in his fist. Sheriff Holt stopped wearing the badge when a boy you wouldn't have trusted with fire told him the county wanted a man with more energy. He took his hat and his moth-eaten authority and went home to a porch that knew his measure. Sometimes at dusk he saw two figures on the ridge, one moving like arithmetic, the other like a song. He stopped telling himself it was just the way trees look when the light tries to remember how to be kind. Once, on a train bound for nowhere the county admits to, a woman got on with a jar in her lap. The jar held buttons, blue and bone. A girl across the aisle asked for one and was told no in a voice that didn't belong to the woman speaking. I said yes, the girl whispered to nobody, and bit her lip so the word wouldn't fall out and break. In the schoolhouse, Miss Fairweather taught a new generation how to spell inventory and promise and river. She did not teach wolves. She tied her own ribbon on the last day of the term and didn't look back. Some nights she lit a lamp and read from a book bound in oilcloth, not the sisters but one she'd built from memory. Names, dates, marks that only make sense if you were there. Beside Eliza and Pearl? She drew a bell and a ladder both. There were sightings the way there are always sightings. A pair of women stepping off a ferry upriver who moved like they'd learned to ghost a footprint. Two figures carrying a sack between them along a ridge no one uses because it remembers war. A whisper at a county line store. They bake pies so sweet you forget your own name. Men laughed because laughter is what men do when their faces don't want to say sorry. One winter so cold it turned breath to knives. A hunter found a cave mouth you could have missed if your heart wasn't beating slow. Inside, shelves cut from the clay itself. Jars. Lids waxed. Names written tiny, not on the jars but along the shelves. Martha, Nancy, Ruthie, 3 more he wouldn't say out loud. The jars held nothing the sheriff could show a jury. Instead, there were tokens. Thimbles, ribbons, pennies worn thin, scraps of dress like the memory of a color. The hunter backed out like a man leaving a church after a scandal. He told nobody directly, and everybody by the way he stopped going up that ridge. One last parcel came down the creek in spring, small enough to catch in the reeds and stubborn enough to demand hands. Inside, a bell clapper wrapped in blue. The new bell in the church rang hollow that Sunday, like it had lost the part that gives a voice its reason. The deacon said replacement would take time. The congregation sang anyway, voices thin but present. And then, like a story told by a man who wants sleep more than answers, the sisters were seen in town buying train tickets under names that fit their mouths too well. 18 still, if you didn't look close. Tired in the way of old women, if you did. Pearl thanked the clerk for making the change even. Eliza counted the coins aloud. They boarded. The train exhaled. The mountain watched without blinking. What's left is an outline and a question. In a bowl of mountains that keeps more than it shares, 2 sisters learned every rule the county used to keep itself from waking. Then they broke those rules with the ordinary tools of a kitchen and a ledger. Patience, inventory, ground that holds, jars that refuse to forget. No curses. No wolves. Just choices, and the long arithmetic of never being forgiven for making them. We are told decent stories come with punishments and receipts. We are told wickedness must end at a scaffold or a drowning stone, and goodness at a porch where someone waits with a lamp. This one refuses that paperwork. The law never proved what mouths learned to say only in kitchens with the water boiling. The river never offered more than it had to. The Oilcloth book, if it lived where women keep instructions nobody writes down. Maybe Eliza and Pearl went north and opened a pie shop and counted the faces that walked in, learned who to feed and who to send to the longer road. Maybe they sank into the mountain and became what old-timers mean when they say don't take the creek path after noon. Maybe they married, had girls, taught them how to tie a knot that doesn't read as a knot until you pull it. We don't get that page. We get the echo. Because some rituals are worth keeping. Tell me where you're watching from. If you're new here, subscribe. We uncover the histories that hiss when the light hits them, the ones the ledgers tried to edit. Drop a like if this long cold walk into the hollow kept you with us. And answer this in the comments. Were Eliza and Pearl evil, or were they the arithmetic the county forced into being? If they were a warning, who was meant to heed it? Men with hats like verdicts, or women who say yes because the road insists? History won't give us an ending that makes hands clean. It will give us a cracked bell that rang true once, a creek that returns what you bind properly, a flour tin with a list written small enough to shame anyone who reads it, and a pair of sisters who stayed 18 in the mouths of people too scared to admit they grew old and kept going. Reality is colder than any campfire tale, and it keeps better in jars. If you want more long, haunted dives into the stories the official books don't footnote, you know what to do. Subscribe. Share this with someone who trusts the daylight too much. And tell me, if a bell rang only once in your county, would you pull the rope again, or would you pretend you never heard it?